Sure, thanks very much, Jim. And I'm more than happy to sort of talk right the way through the presentation slides, but equally, please interrupt me. I haven't got the chat box in front of me, but Jim, if there are any questions as I go, or people want to comment on what I say or disagree, that's brilliant. It gives me a rest as well. So I'll be happy to be stopped in my tracks. But anyway, thanks very much for the invitation to present to you all. I mean, the first thing is a sort of a declaration that in my current sort of role as sort of head of program design and learning technology at the University of York, there's no obligation for me contractually to do any research at all, and some parts of the university think that professional services shouldn't be doing this, that this is the domain of the academics, and that's the sort of culture I've come up against, and it's one that I firmly disagree with, because I think evidence-based practice is the key to good practice and to winning the hearts and minds of academics. And we're in a research-based university, so we're often challenged about where's your evidence for introducing this change or that change. So supporting evidence-based evaluation of central services is something I've always done, but equally I've been sort of passionate about supporting academics who want to enter into the space of educational research as well. And this paper that I'm going to be speaking about is very much one of those. It's a collaboration with two academics, a husband and wife team in our Department of Biology, who wanted to learn more about sort of educational research, and we teamed up. So that's what I'll be talking about. In terms of the menu, this is kind of what Jim asked me to address these points. So I'll say something about how the project came about, and then defining the scope of the research and how we arrived at the right methods. And then I'll talk more generally about the journey to final publication in the Research and Learning Technology Journal, and I'll finish up with some lessons learned. So that's what I'm going to cover for you today. Okay, so I mean, first of all, as a former historian, actually, I always find timelines, chronology helpful. So here's really the chronology of my involvement in this paper, writing the paper. Got involved initially, sort of invited into the Department of Biology in February 2018 to sort of talk about their plans around sort of peer-led learning and use of Slack. And 3 years later, almost, well, a little bit more than that, a paper was published in the journal. So quite a lengthy period of time. But I think the first point is that there was no, it was never predetermined in February, my first sort of involvement with a project, that we would publish. And I think that's the nature of our profession and what we're here to do, support evaluation, but not necessarily, I mean, evaluation outputs can come in many different formats. So a journal article isn't always the right one, and it wasn't clear until sort of midpoint in the work that that's the direction of travel that we were going to follow. Equally, I just want to reassure people, I'm not suggesting for 1 minute that it takes 3 years from start to finish to get something published. You can do it far quicker than that, but as you can see from the timeline, this was broken up into concentrated periods of time when I had time to work on the project. So 2018 to 19 was the data collection period, and then there is this sort of hiatus, and then May start to put together a skeleton of a paper, what it might look like, and then the real nitty-gritty drafting was over the summer period, when we can have some quality time to actually do that work from June to July to first submission in August 2020. And then after that, obviously waiting to hear back from the journal and resubmit, and then finally see it published in March. So 3-year period, but it doesn't take all that time to get something done. So how did I become involved? I think the first thing, and as a learning technologist and program design sort of person, is it's good to have a network across the university, teaching and scholars in different departments very interested in doing applied research based on their own sort of subject domain. So that's a sort of a good outlet to do sort of collaborations, as well as program leads and more senior sort of managers. So I always encourage my team and and myself to actually sort of try and sort of pick up on what's going on in departments and offer our services, which may be simply to review evaluation plans that departments are thinking about, or in some cases to be actively involved like this one. And it helps if you've got credit in the bank already, and in terms of having worked on and demonstrated that you're sort of capable in this area. So with biology department, I'd done work with them previously on student transition to higher education, building VLE sites, and actually reviewing their impact in terms of how that helps students on their journey to higher education as one example. Also MOOCs, that sort of thing. So actually having that relationship as a starting point, it's money in the bank, because you don't know when you're going to cash in terms of being able to do something really exciting, but by building that trust and those relationships, then things can move quite quickly. And in this case, I was sort of brought in to advise on a project which they'd already started on, which was an elective for a final year undergraduate biology research project, which they were leading in. It was around genomes and the use of bioinformatic tools, which I won't go into that sort of detail, but what they were seeking to do was to try and address a long-standing problem, which was their students, when they do these sorts of projects, they tend to just work in silos. All the sort of the collaborative behaviors that you would see in a physical lab, where people spontaneously ask questions and share what's going on with their own sort of lab work. None of that actually happens in dry research projects. So what they wanted to do was try and, although students were conducting their own independent projects, they wanted to build in that sense of information sharing, collaboration and support, and from a multidisciplinary perspective as well, because it's important to say that each of these projects were looking at different aspects of sort of genomes, dealing with different data sets. So they weren't doing the same thing, but they could have their approach to their work could be shared. And my colleagues James and Seth really felt that by baking in that collaboration, this would be good for employability as well. So that's the sort of the genesis of the project and what they wanted to do. So the solution, what they came up with and what I helped them with, was to actually sort of frame this as a blended learning peer-led group research project. So that's based around the use of near peers to facilitate unguided group individual project work. So near peers and peer-led group work, you can see there's an offshoot of collaborative learning theory. So collaboration obviously is when students are all working on one enterprise and at the same time, as opposed to cooperative learning, where students will have individual components of a larger task which they will get on with, which sort of feed in. This is different in that it is a group of independent researchers with different projects being facilitated in sharing ideas about their different approaches to group work by someone who's more experienced. And the use of near peers is very common in as I say, wet in the biology lab, in wet projects, through demonstrators, facilitators who are there on tap in order to support students. So it was that sort of approach that they were looking for. And the blended aspect of this was weekly plenary face-to-face meetings when the academics and the students and near peers, these postgraduate students who were performing that role, would come together. But during the week, when students were left to their own devices, they could be working on these projects on campus or off campus, anywhere, and they were given a sort of virtual space where they were encouraged to feel comfortable in sharing what they were doing, ask questions, share practice. And the tools that were used for that were institutional ones. So Google Team Drive, which I'm not going to talk an awful lot about, and this wasn't really sort of central to the research we did, but that was a kind of repository for some sort of shared digital files which all students had as a sort of a starter for how to approach these projects. So that was setting out the context and protocol for what they were doing. But Slack was the sort of medium through which they interacted. And Slack, when we started this in 2017, was one of the new kids on the block. You know, similar sort of genre of next generation sort of team-based platforms with all the sort of benefits of social media in terms of prompts for communication, as well as a searchable message repository, which and different channels through which students could interact with their peers and others, and with those sort of push out notifications of as well. So a bit of everything there, with mixing social media with digital repository facilities too. So those were institutionally owned platforms, but Slack really hadn't got going at all as a teaching tool at that point. It was more for staff use at a sort of staff departmental collaboration sort of level, but not for teaching. So when we started, it's important to say, and this is one of the aspects of the project, you don't have to have big numbers to do good research. You can do sort of rich picture research with small numbers, and we certainly started with our first cohort in 2017-18. Only 6 students went for this bioinformatics elective, and what Seth and James presented to me was, in terms of how they wanted to research this, this was their sort of start of a 10. You know, we're interested in learning about student engagement with Slack. Will that work as a collaborative tool, because this is new? Can it support peer-led project work? And what lessons can we learn about this for a sort of future course design? Because this was the first time they were doing things in this blended way. Now, you know, we've all been through COVID now and remote learning, so this doesn't seem as revolutionary as it was then, when they're really sort of taking the whole project work off campus for the majority of the student time. Which I think leads me on to this sort of statement of the sort of challenge that we were facing. And I think all of us, you know, if we're not full-time researchers, this is the reality we face. So there is in my view, an idealized sort of pathway for how research can be conducted. And I was originally sort of research trained, did my PhD by doing some outline sort of reading, and well, a whole sort of build up of sort of papers to identify the sort of the target research area that I wanted to sort of look at. And then when I got on the sort of PhD track, I did a sort of more detailed literature review in order to understand the state of the art in terms of where research was at, and from there define my niche, you know, and sort of build research questions around that sort of niche area that I was going to look at. And then from there, sort of think about the experimental design, how I was going to research this particular sort of these key questions that I identified, and then from that, identify and select the right research methods. And that's what I did, you know, and I put it all into a position paper, which I did to defend in front of a faculty, and then sort of seek ethical approval, and then away I went. So that's the idealized pathway, but that just doesn't work with learning technologists most of the time, because we're not paid to do that, and we're largely reacting to opportunities where they arise for collaborations. That's certainly the case for me. So when I got into this cycle, the experimental design, the use of Slack, Google, was already predefined, and these sort of higher level sort of research questions were already being formed. And in terms of the research methodology, my colleagues had already designed some survey instruments, entry and exit surveys for their students, which focusing more on the confidence levels that those students had with their use of the bioinformatics tools. So when I came in, it was really to sort of take a step back, and as you can see, the sort of the quote below, I won't read it out, but that's one of the notes. It's an extract from an email which I sort of sent out early on in the project to colleagues, you know, trying to take a step back to think about what are the sort of the big questions we're looking at here, and to really sort of hone those research questions. So refine them, and then from there, confirm the right research methods that we needed to do the job in understanding what we were looking for, and then and only then seek ethical approval, and then get on with the research. So it's a little cart before horse, not quite the conventional way that you'd want to do a research project, but I think that reflects the reality of to do things. So with that, came up with the sort of the definition of the research questions, which at first sight you may think, well, they don't really sort of move us on a great deal. But the first question was really focusing on the blended design approach, which had kind of not really been sort of flushed out in the original thinking about this. So looking at specifically how peer-led learning works both face-to-face and online, and the complementary nature of the virtual time that students spent within Slack. And then the second question was about Slack as a collaborative platform. Can it do the job in supporting peer-led learning? And by that, looking at the affordances of Slack as a tool for knowledge sharing in particular and problem solving, which was those are the kind of behaviours that we were interested in and wanted to see students engaging in their research tasks. So that was the sort of the definition. And from those research questions, once those were agreed and we were all happy with them, then and only then you really you should be thinking then about the research methods and how you're going to look at this. And what we came up with was I think it's a transition from simply looking at surveys, which is the default sort of behavior of academics and quite a lot of people because of the ubiquitous sort of end of term module survey. There'd been a slight twist on this, as I said, in that we had originally sort of identified sort of entry and exit surveys to measure the changes in confidence that students had with bioinformatics tools. But when we sort of interrogated, what the research project was all about, we sort of changed tack, and in terms of focusing very much more on the learning and the blended learning design. And there are many ways in which you can approach this from an objective perspective. On measuring learning, we could look purely at the activity logs that Slack generate in terms of when students communicated within Slack and with whom they communicated. We could track that and even do network analysis around that. And so the activity log's very interesting. But what we were also interested in is understanding student intentions in terms of why they used the tools, Slack, the environment, in the way they did, who they contacted and why. And equally, what we couldn't see through simply statistics, there's a lot of behaviours that will be going on which are not transparent to the researcher, that will take place outside the formal environment that we're working in. So in order to capture all of that, we went for semi-structured focus groups, which was actually one of the things that I did because I was new to completely independent of to this course and to the students. I could do that, and those focus groups were arranged after the main project work had been completed by students, but before they'd received any assessment. So we wanted to avoid what's called the halo horns effect of bias based on students' perceived performance and assessment. So the focus group side of things really important in terms of getting a sense through student eyes their sort of their take on experience. But also we did something more with the activity logs. What we wanted to do was to try and get a sense of what was going on there in terms of the different layers of learning. And for that, got some prior experience of doing that type of work, content analysis, in a sort of previous paper on blended problem-based learning research, which I did for a master's law program. I used Fox and Mikio's framework of for content analysis, which involves 16 different categories of cognitive thinking. So it's a very useful framework, and I'd recommend sort of looking at it if you're doing content-based analysis. So very interested in using that again because it mapped very well to the stated objectives for the peer-led learning research that we were interested in. So essentially what we're looking at here is self-directed research, and the type of behaviours could range from simply sharing of resources, opinion forming, sort of making declarative statements of how students were progressing with their project, and sharing their results, all the way up to higher order cognitive skills. So by that, articulating and explaining the research findings that they were having, also looking at what their colleagues were doing, critiquing and challenging the conclusions that they were reaching. So that's very much the sort of the higher end, the higher order. So what we did was to, and I'll say a little bit more about this later on, but we went through all the sort of contributions by students, staff, and near peers, our postgraduate students, and each as a unit of analysis, each message was one unit, but it could have multiple categories of behaviours within that unit. And what we did was then classify them against those 16 different categories from the framework. So that there were some hard yards in doing that work. It's quite mind-numbing, but and it would have been great if we'd had a research team, a wider research team, to share this out. But it was very revealing in the end in terms of providing an insight into the type of behaviours that were being exhibited. And once we'd done all of that, James, who's highly sort of technically literate, developed a Python script which enabled us to sort of log all this information and then categorize those behaviours based on a further layer of categorization. So we use Rodriguez's methodology to group together some of these behaviours in order to distinguish, to have between purely sort of collaborative behaviours, such as information sharing resources, acknowledging contributions and asking sort of questions. So we'd classify all of those then together as a meta category around collaboration. And then we group together what we saw as the higher order cognitive behaviors under this banner of criticality. So they were from the Fox and McKeough framework, just proposing actions based on developed ideas. So this was often something that our near peers did, taking ideas from students and then suggesting further sort of research actions based on what they proposed. Also supporting positions on issues where students would sort of weigh in and give confirmation to a particular research plan or action based on reasoning. 2, individuals actually re-evaluating their whole view on what they'd done based on the feedback they received. So that was all part of the criticality sort of grouping. And as it says on the slide there, then we sort of produced this this spreadsheet with those categories. And that data helped us before we sort of embarked on the focus groups. We already had an idea of what was going on, and then we can actually, through the focus groups, to probe that more with students to get the explanation of from the students' own mouths of why they did what they did and when. So the other aspect of sort of research is when you're doing it in the conventional way, no doubt, you've either got a research fund money or a sponsor, and there's a clear sort of start point and sort of end point, and probably predetermined sort of outputs that you've pledged to deliver. When you're offering an evaluation service as a learning technologist, that's not the case, and so. But in some ways, that's not necessarily a bad thing. Research can be quite dynamic, and the endpoint can be flexible. And so we started off. I was brought in to sort of work with the 2017-18 cohort to run the focus group, and then do some of the data analysis. And some of the results from that weren't quite what we wanted. We found that our students were still contacting academics rather than going through near peers, and the level of sort of sharing information wasn't as good as we'd hoped for. But we learned an awful lot about what the why, the rationale for why that took place. So through a kind of action research sort of approach, unintended at the start, but sort of drawing on those lessons learned, we for the next time we ran this, for the 2018-19 cohort, we introduced near peers and their role more clearly to students at the outset, that they were the main go-to people for queries. They were going to facilitate the learning, and they were sort of the hub through which students should go. And we gave a specific steer for students to share their insights, their questions within their group spaces within Slack, rather than doing what they've been doing in 2017-18, which is sometimes direct messaging the academics. And by doing that, no one else could benefit from the questions that they were asking, because they could only be seen by the academics. So that with that, those corrections, we reran the experiment for the 2018-19 cohort. I'll just show you some slides. I won't go into a huge amount of detail about the research findings, because you can read about that in the paper if you're interested. But what we were doing then in terms of the, if you like, the objective research in terms of looking at the logs was sort of, as I mentioned before, tracking how many times students, staff and near peers interacted in the shared spaces and also in the plenary space. So we had 2 near peers that were managing their groups, and so they would have their own specific groups of students they were working with, and then there would be a plenary channel within Slack where everyone could sort of share ideas as well. So we tracked that by looking at who was asking questions, sharing solutions, displaying data, that sort of thing, and focusing on the peer interaction. So that's the objective side of things. And here are some sort of screenshots of how that was done. This first slide shows students sort of sharing some of the output from their work and actually sort of asking for approval, or am I on the right track? And the near peer is then providing immediate feedback and confirmation of what's going on. And in the second slide, you can see, if you can read the text there, that the near peer is then looking at the results and then providing guidance and suggestions on how to sort of tackle particular errors that they found in the data calculations. So through the tracking and then the coding of students and staff and near peer responses, we through this meta category that we created, we could then sort of graph the pattern of interactions over the course of this particular project, and you can see that sort of displayed here. And I think this is for the 2018-19 cohort, so this is the revised experiment based on the lessons learnt, and this seems to be going in the right direction, in that at the beginning of the project you can see staff activity is highest, and that's is to be expected as they introduce the project and the ground rules, the protocol, and that drops off after sort of week 10, and we see students and near peers becoming much more active in terms of the collaborating in the middle to latter parts of the project. And this slide here gives a little bit more detail about how we visualize the data, and this was done, as I say, through the sort of the Python scripting and through sort of color coding. It's not very accessible, I apologize for that. Breaking all sorts of accessibility rules here, but you can see the way we've presented visually the different categories of behavior that were coded, such as students offering resources, offering information, replying, and raising questions. So these were very much in the ballpark of collaboration. And you can see the different levels over the different weeks of the course, based on the different roles. And then on to criticality, which was looking then at the higher order behaviors. And again, this corrective approach that we introduced for the 2018-19 cohort seems to have worked, in that you see this peak with near peers from week 12 onwards, sort of really sort of leading on this sort of the critical engagement with students, and staff very much dropping off, which is what we wanted. We wanted staff to deal with the sort of the bigger picture summaries of student sort of work at the in the face-to-face sessions, but we wanted the online, the Slack, to really be the domain where near peers would lead that facilitation, and that seems to be borne out by our coding and the figures there. So we got all this wonderful data, and we've got those insights, and the immediate payback, if you like, is that the behaviours that we were looking for in the 2018-19 cohort actually were realised, and that we saw less traffic going to academics, more critical engagement supported by the near peers. So that's all good, but what more could we do with that data? Well, at the start, we didn't have a clear dissemination plan, and again, in a conventional project you probably would have one in terms of knowing and pledging to deliver a report or an output of some shape or form. This was a very much a dynamic sort of process where we started off very small, and I however experienced you are with research, I think it's really great to sort of just like you do research in an iterative process, sort of testing your ideas, the research questions. So you do the same, I think, with your dissemination. And we started very small with our own institutional learning and teaching conference with a poster presentation, simply for the first cohort, laying out the use of Slack and what we were doing. And out of the focus group survey and some other research, we produced a case study which was largely for internal consumption for other academics within the biology department to look at, as well as more broadly across the university to think about what team-based environments like Slack can do to support student learning. So that's what we did in summer 2018, and then we moved on as we moved on with the project and transferred these methods over to the 2018-19 cohort. And we built up a bit more data. A set colleague in biology decided to take a paper to Advanced HE STEM conference, and then with a more complete data set, I went up to Edinburgh in September 2019 to ALTSI there and presented a short paper, so a presentation, but actually sort of drafted out a sort of a paper for well, a very short sort of summary of sort of our findings at that point, and that was those various steps very much sort of helpful in helping to refine the sort of the angle of the future paper that we were going to write, and really sort of home in on the USP for the paper, and to think about the also the target journal that we were going to sort of look at. What was that journal interested in, and how could our results and our approach align to that? And of course that would provide us, if you get that alignment right, then you've got a better chance of getting published. So I'm going back to that original project sort of timeline slide now to really sort of just sort of round off now with the actual writing up now of the research. So really we're in May 2020 now. We've got the data. We've been to ALTSI, and the paper was warmly sort of received. There was a lot of sort of supportive commentary in the session, and someone blogged about it afterwards after ALTSI, which was really encouraging. And I would encourage people to do that whenever you attend ALTSI, to sort of give that feedback and give that support. And what I've tended to do in future with ALTSIs is even if it's just a short paper, is actually to write something and offer that up when I'm giving the presentation, with the hope that expectation I might get some sort of interest and critical commentary, because that's really helpful then in sort of testing out your ideas and getting you on the pathway to a more formal publication. So May 2020 had some time, so there was a bit of a hiatus after ALTSI, but in May managed to find some time, do a skeleton outline, which was shared with James and Seth, and then we had various meetings where we actually then did some collaborative drafting on the paper, and then we had something which we could put into research and learning technology as our first submission. Why did we choose that particular journal? Well, I think there are a number of reasons why. I mean, first of all, I think ALTSI has made a sort of an explicit sort of link in the conference for those people interested in research to actually target the journal. Obviously, so it's one that's obviously easily identifiable for our profession. It's got a clear learning technology mission there, but equally, it's interested in innovations, evaluative studies, and specifically for what we were doing here, longitudinal studies as well. And if we've got a criticism of what we do in learning technology, tends to be very sort of short-lived sort of case studies. We produce sort of results for a sort of one-off rather than a persistent sort of innovation. So it's hard to have that sort of longer term picture of how effective our interventions are. What we've done here is, through action research, we got data over a 2-year period, so we thought that would play well with the journal as well. So all of those things are important, but equally the fact that it's an open journal, Creative Commons, and has got a decent impact factor as well, were attractive to us for our choice of the journal. So with all of those sort of factors in mind, that helped in the way we positioned the paper, and also the cover letter explaining why we wanted this, to submit this paper to the journal. These things are all important, and you shouldn't underestimate those when actually presenting your paper. But then submitted it, and then we had to wait a couple of months, and then we got feedback from the reviewers. Now, I can only speak from personal experience here, but I've only had one paper, I think, which is one or two papers which have been accepted first time round. I think it's very rare. It's quite common to be asked for revisions, and although that's disappointing, because at the time you think, you've worked, and like a sculpture, you've gone through sort of many iterations and fine tuning of the paper. It's a bit of a shock to get some searching criticisms, but I've learned over the years to really see this as an extended part of the writing process, because what you're getting there is some fresh perspectives to really sharpen up the paper and ensure that it really delivers well. So, and that's what we got through the resubmission process. So I'll just show you this slide here, responding to the reviewers. This is how I sort of did it. Write a cover letter, obviously thanking reviewers for the time that they have taken, and when they've offered constructive but searching criticisms. And then what I've done for each reviewer, there's a table there with point by point the criticisms that they've raised, and then our response to those criticisms. So one of the things we got was that you can't make a sort of a causal link between your research design and then all students receiving sort of doing well, in terms of their academic output. And it's true, all students had in the 2018-19 got marks above and beyond of what we normally would have expected for these projects. But absolutely right to say that's a claim we couldn't possibly make. We needed to be clear in terms of the contribution that we were making in the paper. So we couldn't make any sort of case for cause and effect in terms of between the learning design and outcomes. But what we could talk about, and more clearly, was the engagement patterns that we observed through the use of Slack, demonstrating the potential of collaborative platforms to support near-peer learning. So that's what we could talk about, and as part of an exploratory research approach. And we could also talk about some of the emergent variables which we had seen in with the first cohort, and then addressed in terms of the guidance we provided students around clearer communication of instructional roles, socialization of students, and of course training for our near peers around their responsiveness to the needs of students. And from all of that, we could make a sort of a clear contribution in terms of there's always a sort of a so what with a paper. Why should you publish this? What is your contribution to the body of knowledge? And ours was then a sort of a framework for near peer learning conducted sort of virtually, but one that we felt could be applied to other team-based environments, so Microsoft Teams, not just Slack, and to other disciplinary contexts as well. So that's how we defined our USP, and the reviews were very helpful in helping us to sharpen that up, as well as to make a few connections with our own sort of literature survey to some other Learn Tech papers which we hadn't seen. So that's it, Jim, more or less. I'll just round off with some learning points, and these are the things that I sort of take out of this sort of 3 years sort of journey. One is an obvious one, which is be open to these sort of collaboration opportunities, and you can generate them in a variety of ways, as I said, through the work you do with departments. Also, we've done centrally, we run evaluation of learning technology projects. We actually run training around that, around evaluation approaches, and build that in also to our postgraduate certificate of academic practice training. So that's a way of getting the message out to academics that if you're interested in doing applied research, we can help. And then the second point, obviously, be flexible and adaptable in your evaluation approaches. But that takes two to tango as well. And I had fantastic collaborators in Seth and James Chong, who were open to sort of changing their thinking around the use of surveys and the sort of the confidence approach to a much broader sort of take on blended learning. And then patience. So I think the key thing to sort of take out of today is from what we did is that nothing's predetermined, and the beauty of it, there's nobody putting a gun to your head saying you've got to publish, publish or perish. That's the pressures that professional researchers have to live under, and that's one of the reasons why I'm not doing that job, because that does put you under a lot of strain. But the beauty of this is that we could sort of test out ideas along the way with different outputs, get feedback, and then decide when we were ready to actually go for a formal publication. And in some cases, you'll look at the data, and we certainly did after the 2017-18 sort of cohort, and thought there isn't enough here really to do a publication. There isn't a compelling message. It's really only after we'd done the corrective work that we could see and we refined our focus that we had something. And then don't be discouraged with criticism. And I'm sure you all probably are involved in reviewing articles. I do that, and I think that's it's quite right and proper that we all sort of muck in that respect. But and so I've seen it from both sides, and the review process. But if it's done in a constructive way, however challenging, it's valuable, and those comments really valuable to refining your article. And then the final point, just to finish off, is the journey doesn't finish after you get that publication. It's wonderful to tweet it out afterwards, yeah, but who's going to read it? You've got to actually then point people to the article, and that obviously I've got my agent here, secret agent Jim, who does some of my publicity work for me. But no, you've got to actually summarize and boil down what are the key messages, the takeaways. So what I did and I do with sort of my research work is then blog about it. So I on a WordPress site, really sort of I blogged that. So that was for internal purposes to draw people in from within the university, but also externally as well. So that's important. Don't forget to do that. And of course, with research and learning technology, you get wonderful metrics to see who's tweeting, looking at what you're doing. But just to round off, I just want it'd be remiss of me not to acknowledge my collaborators, James and Seth Chong, that they were the discipline domain experts. They kicked this all off, and they played a big part in the writing of this paper. And our near peers, Annabelle and Kimberly, who played such a sort of a key part in that, and the undergraduate students. And my final slide, and I will finish. These are some of the references. So the case study which we produced after the first cohort, the Fox and McKeough reference, the Rodriguez one, and then the blended PBL one, which explains a little bit more about content analysis and how I did it. And that's that.
Brilliant. Thank you, Richard. Thank you so much. I've learned. I've got a whole list of questions